The Republic of Argentina is undoubtedly one of the most iconic countries in the world. It is widely recognized for the great quality of their meats as well as their exotic landscapes. It is the third leading economy in Latin America, just behind Brazil and Mexico. In South America, it has always had a historical, economic, and social rivalry with one of its most important competitors and partners, Brazil. About 115 years ago, Argentina was one of the richest countries on the planet in reference to their GDP per capita. A century of military coups, populist governments, wars, ineptitudes, and other circumstances marked the economic degradation of Argentina from being one of the richest countries in the world to one of the most stagnant economies in the world, and one of the worst on the continent just after Venezuela. In a way, Argentina has always been accompanied by the constant economic swings in the last decades. The Argentine economic history is much too complicated to summarize in a 10-minute video. However, I'll recap the most important events in recent times in order to explain what is going on with Mauricio Macri, the current president of Argentina, who is soon seeking re-election. The outcome of the next election is not at all certain due to recent economic and historical events. Today, at the hands of Mauricio Macri, poverty in Argentina has increased. The country is still in a deep recession that has reduced the GDP by more than 2%, and the country has the highest inflation in the Americas just after Venezuela. The decline of Argentina has politicians, lawyers, economists, and academics scratching their heads. Many are still trying to understand the country's decline in order to seek out plausible solutions for its recovery. Today, we will go over one of the most controversial issues in Latin America, the rise and decline of Argentina. So without further introduction, let's begin. Let's go back into the past. It is the year 1910, just 4 years before the beginning of the First World War. So what was the context in the region more than 100 years ago? Is it similar now, with Mexico and Brazil as the leading countries in Latin America? In fact, it wasn't. The main power at the time was Argentina, also one of the world's most advanced countries. Their GDP was nearly half the entire Latin America combined. It was among the top 10 economies in the world, just behind Australia, the UK, and the United States, but still ahead of France, Germany, and Italy. The GDP per capita of Argentina was almost triple the Japanese GDP. However, today, it's the exact opposite. At this point, Argentina was the largest economy in Latin America, and in terms of wealth, was 6 times richer than Brazil. These levels of economic wealth were maintained even after the First World War until the mid-1930s, where we hit a major turning point. After this year, Argentina's economy degraded in comparison to the most developed countries in the world. Although Argentina had periods of strong growth in the last century, especially during the boom of the commodities between 2004 and 2014, and their population still being richer than most of Latin America, its position as one of the most vibrant economies of the world was just a distant memory. Today, the GDP per capita of Argentina is only 43% of economies such as France, Germany, and the UK. Even in the region, Chile and Uruguay fare way better. The political symptoms of the decline are also clear. If Argentina seemed to enjoy stability in the pre-war era, its history since then has been marked by a succession of military coups. The first came in 1930, others followed in 1943, 55, 62, 66, and 76. The 1989 election marked the first time in more than 60 years that a residing president had handed over power to an elected successor at the polls. Even if more than 30 years have passed since the end of the military dictatorship, democracy in Argentina has not led to a stabilization of the country. Many citizens of Argentina use the example of a pendulum to describe the radical changes of social-economic policies of the last 3 decades. From loose economic policies conducted in the 1980s to the economic liberation pushed by Uncle Sam in the 90s, and back in the new millennium under the presidency of Nestor Kirchner and then of his wife Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. But even a pendulum is more stable than Argentina. They experienced recessions in the 70s and 80s, with the hyperinflation of 1989 and 1990 and another economic crisis in 2001. Explaining the case of Argentina is a true enigma for economists, who for decades have tried to understand the origin of the problem. And since economics is considered as a social science, it depends on man and society, unlike the exact sciences, which means that economic effects will differ from country to country. Simon Kuznets, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, stated that there were 4 types of countries in the world: the developed countries, the non-developed countries, Japan, and Argentina. This is because the case of Japan and Argentina are unique in the world. On one hand, we have Japan, which experienced a process of accelerated industrialization in less than 60 years and became the second global economy at the beginning of the year 2000. In the 60s, however, Japan and Argentina had exactly the same GDP per capita, but by 2013, the Japanese GDP per capita was 5 times better than Argentina's GDP per capita. There are many countries that have managed to copy or imitate Japanese industrialization, and there are many theories of what went wrong in Argentina. Argentina is comparable to someone who has been shot, poisoned, stabbed, and suffocated all at the same time. It's hard to determine what really killed the poor victim, and it is absolutely necessary that we determine what caused the situation that has dragged the country's economy for the last few decades. Economist Rafael Ditella explains that in general, there could be three main reasons for Argentina's decline. The first one explains that Argentina was rich 100 years ago, very rich, but it was not modern. This could have caused difficult adjustments when there were external shocks to the economy. When Argentina was rich in the 1910s, it was due to their natural resources, but their industrial base was not yet well developed. To cite an example, in 1914, Buenos Aires and Chicago were the perfect examples of vibrant cities in America. Both were key cities for the transport of ships and goods. And while Chicago had a literacy rate of 95%, Buenos Aires only had a literacy rate of just under 75%. The elites were not very interested in the education of the population. In fact, until the 1940s, Argentina had one of the highest primary school enrollment rates in the world, but secondary school enrollment rates were far below other first world nations. Without a population that is not educated in the secondary and tertiary level, Argentina could not create competitive industries. However, the technology of that golden age allowed it to export meat like never before. In fact, from the year 1910 and 5 following years, Argentina went from exporting 25,000 to 411,000 tons of meat. Argentina had used foreign technology to grow, but never produced their own at the same level as other world powers. Half of the country's capital was in foreign hands in 1913, which added to the country's wealth. However, much of this money was not invested back into the country. In the long term, this was not going to guarantee the country to remain within the top world powers. And in the 60s, the country began to fall behind when France and Japan finally exceeded Argentina's GDP per capita. The second theory explains that Argentina effectively became rich by placing bets on agriculture, free markets, and England, which at the time was one of the great world powers, and in fact, its largest trading partner. If any of these sectors collapsed, Argentina would have many problems to adjust their accounts, and in fact, this is exactly what happened. When the First World War hit, the debt levels increased with it. Thirdly, England was also at a decline at the time, and it began to prefer to trade with the Commonwealth nations instead of its South American partner. In a way, 20th century Argentina was desynchronized with the rest of the world. It had a growth model based on free trade exports, but the world wars were strong external shocks for Argentina. After World War II, when the developed countries began to open free trade again, Argentina had already become a closed economy, and it remained under the command of Juan Domingo Perón. So in the year 1946, an institution to control national trade was created, along with more regulations and more autocratic policies that increased the price of food, which was a great benefit for exporters, but a detriment for ordinary citizens. The income of the richest 1% of Argentines was strongly correlated with exports of crops and livestock. As the urban and working class population grew, so did the electoral districts susceptible to Perón's promises to support the industry and strengthen workers' rights. Many analysts believe that some sectors of the Argentine economy were capable of competing internationally, such as agriculture, but other sectors were too degraded due to the intrusion of the state. There were even some markets where Argentina was a leader, which started to break down. During the Kirchner era, they tried to lower the price of food products. President Nestor did this by limiting the export of wheat, meat, and other foods, as well as the implementation of strong export taxes. The state was able to obtain foreign currency, but the food production sectors declined because they could not export to their full potential, which caused many farmers to stop planting food or having livestock. The perverse effects of the intervention have been amply demonstrated in the Kirchner era. According to the US Department of Agriculture, Argentina was the fourth largest exporter of wheat in 2006, and by 2013, it had fallen to 10th place. The country had lost 10 million heads of cattle, and neighboring countries such as Brazil and Uruguay quickly surpassed Argentina in the international trade market. Meanwhile, Brazil had become the world's largest exporter of beef and poultry in the last 2 years. Today, Argentina is the sixth leading exporter of beef with 2.7 million heads of cattle. Uruguay, which is 17th on the same list, has 600,000 heads of cattle, or the equivalent to 1 head of cattle for every 11 citizens. Nowadays, beef is one of the few sectors of economic activity where the current administration, which had its position since December 2015, can show favorable figures. The president, at the beginning of his mandate, reduced taxes on exports. And according to official data, in the first 5 months of 2018, Argentina exported 60% more beef than in the same period in 2017. So that translates to 121,277 tons against 75,934. However, in late 2018, the president reimposed heavy taxes on soybean exports according to balance accounts, with strong austerity mandates. Even so, Argentina's problems are much deeper than a simple issue of exports. The third explanation may be the distrust of the financial markets in Argentina. Explaining each of the crises and recessions of the country would take many videos. One of the most important crises was in 2001, when the country went into a default, a transfer of payments, and a large part of it was owed to the International Monetary Fund. Because of this default, Argentina was always marked as a black sheep, and thanks to the boom of commodities, it managed to pay back the debt to the IMF in 2007 under President Kirchner's command. After 2007, his wife assumed power, and public spending was increased and largely subsidized many elements of daily life, from public services and even football broadcasts. One of the most controlled situations was the exchange rate, which created all sorts of practical problems, such as the rise of the black market dollars, which heavily distorted prices. Thus, a parallel market of the dollar and the Argentine peso was created. But as it happened in Venezuela, with a fixed exchange rate imposed by the government, it was only logical that a parallel market of US dollars would appear. This changed when Macri decided that the peso should fluctuate freely against the dollar, thus freeing the exchange rate. When he decided to do this, the Argentine peso devalued by more than 30%, and when he released the currency, inflation was at around 25%, and this involved risks such as the reduction of the citizens' purchasing power and an increase in inflation. And this is exactly what happened. Now, Argentina has an inflation that exceeds more than 50%, having the highest inflation in the continent just after Venezuela. Argentina's government insists that its problems lie in liquidity and not in the solvency to meet its financial obligations. With the lack of liquidity due to a continuous string of deficits, President Macri promised to reach a zero deficit, but it was forced to go to the IMF. In May, the IMF issued a loan for more than $50 billion to Argentina in exchange for even stronger austerity measures. The president announced that this would help investors to have more confidence in Argentina, but only 7 months after the IMF approved the loan, the Argentine peso remained at its weakest point in the last 4 years. And today, while Argentina is in recession, opponents of the current administration argue that its policies of austerity and social cuts have sunk the country into a recession. New taxes, the release of the peso, and inflation of 50% have led the country into another crisis. This is a very complicated issue which drags decades of history, dictatorships, wars, state intervention, bank bailouts, defaults, and the IMF. The third largest economy in Latin America is the most important country to be in a crisis within the continent. Argentina is part of the G20, the 20 most industrialized countries in the world, but many are questioning Argentina's membership in the organization, arguing that its economy is far too weak compared to the other 19 countries. Obviously, we can't cover everything in this one video, and another follow-up video will be made to explore possible solutions for the crisis from several different points of view. So what do you think about the current crisis in Argentina? Do you think that the president is making the necessary adjustments, or do you think he is further worsening the situation? And were you surprised to learn that Argentina was once one of the 5 richest nations on the planet? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this every single week.